All right, we'll go ahead and get started to make sure we have plenty of time. Um, so I'll just start with a brief introduction. Ann Wilson is a professor in the psychology department at Wilfrid Laurier, which I would have mispronounced if you had not mentioned it last night, University. She received her PhD in social psychology from the University of Waterloo and is a former Canada Research Chair in social psychology and a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Her work primarily focuses on identity over time, examining how processes related to individuals' identities impact the self, interpersonal relationships, and social and national identities. So her interests intersect a range of subjects, including well-being, goal pursuit, change and stability, and moral and criminal transgressions. It was very nice for me to see someone who studies such a wide array of topics as a person myself who keeps getting interested in different things, and to see someone who can do that successfully is always encouraging. So recently, her research has focused on intergroup processes underlying political polarization, which is why we have brought her out today. And her work has received funding from numerous sources and been published in top-tier journals, such as the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce you guys to Ann Wilson and get to hear a little bit more about her work today. And really, some of her work is what I started learning about at the beginning of my process of trying to get into the literature on political polarization. So it really is a delight to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy, so much for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be here. And this is the lineup of speakers that you have. What a great opportunity for all of you to hear about so many interesting projects. And I feel like I'm a bit of a dilettante among the folks that you've been hearing from, but I hope that I can contribute something that's still relevant. So this is a relatively new line of research for me, and I'll point to a few places where there are papers under review in preparation. There's some preprints that are available and that sort of thing. But so bear with me, a lot of it is relatively new, and I want to walk through a few different topic areas. So there's going to be a little bit of a grab bag, but I think that they all connect together. And I want to start by acknowledging my collaborators, but especially Victoria Parker, who is the PhD student who's worked with me on all of this stuff and is really the one that I would like to identify with the work, as well as any of the nice looking slides. I will also credit to her. She's definitely the visual artist when it comes to presenting this kind of work as well. So I'm going to talk about political polarization, real and imagined. And likely, if you've been coming to this seminar and if you're interested in this topic, I don't need to convince you that political polarization is certainly on the rise, and especially political animosity and dislike for one's opponents. But regardless, some of you might still need some convincing that this is potentially a problem. So I want to put it in context here by making a bit of a parallel to begin with. So this is the one of the scales used to measure dehumanization. So a very kind of like overt and literal kind of way of looking at that. And we know from past research that some ethnic groups are dehumanized relative to Americans. So these are some of the numbers that might give people pause when they see them, right? That Muslims, Arabs, Mexican immigrants are all dehumanized on a scale like this relative to Americans as a standard. And we know that this is concerning, and we generally recoil when we hear terms like vermin or other things like that associated with ethnic groups. Yet one thing that often we don't really stop and even notice or take issue with is the same sort of language that's sometimes used to characterize our political opponents. And so just to compare these numbers, there's some recent research looking at the degree to which people dehumanize their political opponents. And these numbers, as I would say, are concerning enough, are about 3 times larger. So the amount that we dehumanize our opponents is considerably starker than the amount that we dehumanize even the most dehumanized ethnic groups. So to me, this gives me pause. What does this look like in a broader sense? So I don't know if there's data. I don't think that there's data on that scale, at least looking at dehumanization across a longer time span. But we do have data looking at these kinds of measures. So this is a measure of just political warmth and coldness. So how much do you dislike the other side? And across the last few decades, we've seen that people generally continue to like their in-group at about the same rates, but the degree to which they're disliking their out-group has gotten starker and starker over this time period. So this is work from Eli Finkel and his colleagues in 2020, demonstrating this over a fairly long period of time. And so one of the questions is, why is this happening? One of the first places that people look to answers is, well, maybe it's because our ideologies are moving further and further apart. So we do know from some other research that polarization in people's attitudes or ideologies, so their sort of policy positions, have become more divided over time across parties. And so these kinds of data are derived by looking at policy positions on the left and on the right, and looking at the difference between those two on issues like how much do you support busing, healthcare, social services, and so on. So the types of items that are in things like the National Election Survey. However, we also know that perceived polarization, or the degree to which people believe that they are divided, is rising even higher, right? So, and rising kind of in tandem with actual polarization. So perceived polarization would be asking people, how much do you think the average Democrat and the average Republican believes these things? And generally people believe that they are even further divided than they actually are. And because we generally judge people on the basis of what we think they think, as opposed to what they actually think, this perception of polarization is probably quite important. So what we've been studying is a form of this perceived polarization. We use the term false polarization along with some others in the literature. And false polarization has been examined in a number of ways. So Aller and Sood, for example, looked at the degree to which we have misconceptions about who belongs to a party. So Democrats tend to way overestimate the number of really wealthy Republicans. Republicans way overestimate the percentage of Democrats who are LGBTQ. So people generally have kind of misconceptions of who belongs to a party. But a lot of the research looks also at these sort of more standard policy positions. So I'll give you an example of the kinds of questions that might get asked. These are questions that would come from the ANES or other kinds of surveys like this. So what do you think the typical Democrat or Republican voter would want to happen to capital gains tax? Or how much social services should they receive, health and education, that sort of thing. And so typically what is going to get compared in this kind of research is the perception of where Democrats are and where Republicans are relative to the actual scores. So those black bars, that's the actual score between Republicans and Democrats, and those dots are the perceptions. Okay, so that's the standard way that this research is often done. And a very fine way to do it. It makes a lot of sense. One of the things that intuitively seemed to be missing in this approach to Victoria and I was that some of these kinds of questions, at least to me, don't inspire the kind of vitriol that we see, right? So like, I don't go, capital gains tax, right? That these people are demons, that they support the capital gains tax like an extra 1.5 relative to where I am, right? I'm not even sure what that would mean. So it seems like there might be something else going on in addition to what's already been really well documented. And so Finkel and colleagues highlighted this too in their paper talking about political sectarianism in America, and highlighted how really it's not just about differences of opinion anymore, but almost a battle between good and evil, and things have become moralized to such an extent that there's a lot more emotion wrapped up in what people perceive. So this is kind of where our starting point was okay, well, what else is there going on that we might be able to add to what we know so far about political polarization? And so we started by looking at the kinds of political caricatures that seem to really get people whipped up in media, in social media, and so on, that seem to go well beyond these kinds of policy positions that are often studied. So for example, this is from a poll in 2018, where people were simply asked in a qualitative way to describe what they thought of Republicans and Democrats, whoever was the opposite party to them. And so the kinds of things that they were saying was not about, well, they don't like social services as much as I do. They were saying things like, I don't want to work and I want cradle to grave assistance. In other words, mommy, right? So this is a caricature of what the left is right from somebody on the right. And on the right, somebody on the left might say, I want a dictatorial system of government. I'm a racist and I hate non-whites. So these are also the kinds of things that we often see. So we've also asked qualitatively for, what do you dislike about conservatives or liberals in the same way? And I will note, I use conservatives and liberals here. I'll explain a little bit why, but I am mostly looking at the US. And so when I use those terms, you can think about them as mapping onto Democrats and Republicans. And these are the sorts of things that people generate. So generally, the ways that people describe their opponents are considerably more extreme and caricatured than the policy positions might suggest. Now, depending on what side of the aisle you might see yourself on, you might think to yourself, well, the other side, that seems about right, but they've got my side wrong, right? And what I would argue is that to some extent, there might be something wrong about both of these perceptions, that both of them are caricatures of what most people on either side are actually about. So this led us to do a bit of literature review and theorize a basic model of where we thought things might be able to get clarified on the basis of like what we already know and what can we add. And so one of the places that we really thought there might be something missing from at least the social psychology research on this and some of the more micro political science was the question of like, where are these ideas coming from, right? So a lot of times social psychologists will focus on basic intergroup processes that lead us to misjudge others and to stereotype them. But it wasn't clear to us that this was helping to explain why this vitriol was getting so much more extreme over time, why the division was increasing and increasing and increasing. And so we thought there had to be something else going on there to help to explain that. And at least part of the answer to us was this level of kind of macro forces in society that were all pushing in the same direction. So we describe this as institutional forces, political elites, partisan media, and social media. And each of these processes are kind of institutional level processes that are all working in the same direction right now to increase and amplify the degree of polarization that we're seeing. There doesn't seem to be any real countervailing force that would dampen polarization. So we've got these three extra things working in the same direction. And so because of all of these that tend to lead people to hear these sort of demonized accounts of their opponents, really caricatured views of their opponents, cherry-picked examples in the media and social media, and how social media also amplifies that, both technologically, right, by algorithms tending to put the things that are most likely to cause us outrage in front of our eyeballs, and also socially because of what we tend to share, being the stuff that makes us angry. All of these forces are going to lead us to have a more and more polarized view of our opponents. This false polarization, then, we think, may be part of what leads to this change in affective polarization over time. So the degree to which we come to view our opponents in a more and more hostile way. And this is something that's more speculative at this point, but we suggest that ideological polarization, so the degree to which we're actually moving further and further apart on our ideologies, may well be more of an outcome of this process rather than the starting place. Where the more we see our opponents as demons, the more we're going to be willing to accept even some pretty bad policies and pretty bad ideas when they come across our radar on our side. Okay, so this is, yeah.
Just curious, for the institutional box, have people looked at whether, I mean, social media is clearly new, and you can imagine what role that's played in amplifying things, but do we know if like the elite media and maybe that's the only other one, has that changed over time too? I mean, I think, well, I'm not going to talk about any networks, but I can think of some networks that seem to have become more polarized, but has that changed or?
Yeah, so and this is a little outside of my expertise, so I'm talking about,
Sure.
but in general, both, there's been some analysis that suggests that both the way that political elite, so this is like, just characters in politics, used to work more across the aisle, right? And so like Newt Gingrich is one of the people that has been credited as changing some of the dynamics and basically saying, no, you're not allowed to interact with your opponents, don't go for a beer with them after, like those kinds of things have started to change over the last number of decades. So at the elite level, there does seem to be some change. This is, pretty broad strokes. And then certainly over the last number of decades, media has also changed. So, there's a whole history of the fairness doctrine and the way that when we only had a few sort of broadcast media kinds of sources for news, that's really changed. So now we have more and more partisan media sources, and people can basically pick and choose where they get their information from. And adding to that, there's also like a different business model for how people make their money, and a lot of it is much more based on the attention economy. So that's going to be like, how many clicks can you get? How long can you be in front of somebody's eyeballs? And so all of those things are, again, pulling for this in the same direction. Right. So what I want to talk about is, I'm not going to be able to fill in all of the gaps and all of that, but that's a starting place for some of the questions that we're asking. And so I do want to touch base on, I guess, 4 big questions. So the first is just asking about political polarization, in particular looking at whether or not polarization is especially evident for these extreme caricatures, as opposed to what we call more moderate views. So more moderate views would be these sort of policy positions and that kind of thing, even if they're things that people disagree on. I'll talk a little bit about some of the antecedents and consequences of this, including things like media. And also that one of the consequences has to do with the obscuring of common ground, that we actually do have more in common sometimes on some policies than we think we do. And then a little bit on how we might be able to mitigate misperceptions. So the first number of things I'll talk about comes from this paper, which you can find online. This is a version, we're still in revision, so there's going to be a new version posted soon, looking at false polarization, the way that we tend to frame it. So I want to spend a minute then to just kind of describe how we talk about extreme versus moderate views. And I think there are some strengths and weaknesses in our approach. So I'd be super interested in thinking about like other ways of getting at this as well. But how we define extreme caricatures, so the ones that we think are really going to move around, often come from the way that we see things characterized in the culture war discourse. So a lot of it comes from partisan media, social media, and the sorts of things that people are getting really outraged about. So an example on the left would be liberal campus snowflakes insisting on no free speech for anybody that is opposing any of their views, that sort of thing. And again, all of these are caricatures. And on the right, sort of the conservative deplorable. So somebody who's opposed to anyone who looks different than them, denying people basic rights because of their immigrant background or ethnic group. And then moderate issues, the way that we characterize these are things that come more from the policy domain. And so part of it, it's not so much just that the topic itself is moderate versus extreme, but the way that we frame the issues. So for example, we use the kind of terminology that you would normally see in a policy statement about supporting universal health care, or again, the terminology that you might see about supporting Second Amendment rights. And I emphasize that it has more to do with framing than the topics themselves, because I can imagine, I'm sure you can imagine, ways in which something like gun rights isn't completely moderate, right? There are ways you could frame that also in extreme ways. And we've tried to do that in some of our later work. So what we do, rather than using the full scale like it's been done in the past and just comparing people's scores, what we've done in our work is ask people first how much they personally agree with each of these issues. And from this, we can derive a percentage of at least somewhat agree for people, for partisans' actual agreement. Okay? And then we ask people to estimate the perceived prevalence of these very same views on both sides of the aisle. And what we're most interested in, what I'll focus on, is what they think about their opponent's views. So for example, here, I'm asking the same question, what percentage of liberals do you think believe this thing? And if somebody answered around there, then you might say, oh, well, this is conservatives actually, but so 82% of conservatives believe this. So then we can compare the actual scores of percentage of agreement to the estimated prevalence scores. Some of our early work a lot of our work was done with Turk Prime or Prolific. And so one thing I want to acknowledge is that some of it is not nationally representative. So keep that in mind in terms of the actual scores. The most recent study we ran, we did use a representative sample, and we asked a lot of these same questions, and we get very, very similar kinds of scores. So just because of our resources, we haven't been able to do that for all of our studies, but we're not seeing any major differences. So this is what we get. I'm not going to show you all of the studies that we ran. I want to give you some examples, but this is the kind of thing that we get for moderate items. So if we ask people about how many do you agree with universal health care, about 95% of liberals say that they at least somewhat agree. Okay, so this is liberals answering about their issue. If we ask people how much they agree with gun rights, about 92% of conservatives say they at least somewhat agree with general Second Amendment rights. Then if we ask liberals to estimate the number of conservatives who agree with something, or conservatives estimating the number of people that are liberal, so it's always the out party estimates here. These are the numbers that we get. So this is liberals, 95% of them agree with universal health care, and conservatives estimate that about 80% of liberals agree with universal health care. And then the same thing here. So what you see here is not false polarization, right? It's pretty accurate. So they know that most liberals or most conservatives agree with these things, but if anything, it's actually a little bit of an underestimate. So that's what we find for moderate. We weren't expecting to see polarization, particularly for moderate, but we never did predict this underestimate. So that's something that's kind of interesting that we don't have a full explanation for. And then this is what we find for the more extreme or caricatured issues. And remember that this is how many people say that they at least somewhat agree. And our scales actually don't have a neutral score, so it's either somewhat disagree or somewhat agree. So what at least somewhat agree means might not be a lot of agreement, but about 34% of liberals agree with banning controversial speakers, so still a minority, not nobody, but still a minority. And about 22% of conservatives at least somewhat agreed with the items on discrimination. So too many, but a lot smaller than the number who the other side estimates. So this is how many conservatives estimates of how many liberals believe in banning speakers, and this is liberals' estimates of the percentage of conservatives who support racist actions. So we find this pattern it jumps around from item to item a little bit, like exactly where the scores are. But we find this pattern really, really consistently. We've done it over 5 studies with different issues and different items. And this is the pattern that we see pretty well across the board. And what we find is that it's almost always the case that for those moderate items, all of the scores are above the midpoint. So everybody is in a majority and people get that right. And for these kinds of items, it's always the case that opponents are in a minority. The number of opponents who actually believe these extreme things are a minority. And the other side always estimates that it's a majority. Just to give you an example of what we've tried to do in more recent studies. So because there is this kind of weird imbalance where the items are different across extreme and moderate, we've tried to deal with that in a couple of different ways, often just by using the same topic, but creating a parallel item that's either extreme or more moderate. So here's a couple of examples of those. I won't give you all of the examples. So moderate items for defunding the police might be that some money from policing should go to mental health and social services. And a moderate item for taxation might be the best way to get money into the pockets of Americans is to cut taxes. But you can also frame an extreme version of each of these questions. So all police departments are irreversibly racist and should just be shut down, or all taxes should be off, basically. Right? So we've also done a number of studies looking at moderate versus extreme in this way, and we find exactly the same thing, that generally people agree with the moderate ones, they disagree with the extreme ones, and the other side really vastly overestimates the extreme ones. So I want to just walk through for this first package a few of the things that we've examined with regard to antecedents and consequences. And some of this is, I'd say, still pretty preliminary, so a lot of it is correlational, and there's still lots of work to be done on it. But we have looked at partisan media and the degree to which people report consuming partisan media in all of these studies. And the reason that we think consuming partisan media should be at least one of the forces here that influences people to overestimate these views is because partisan media tends to cherry pick the worst examples of behavior on the other side. And then those things get run on loop, right? So if you turn on Fox News, you're going to see a liberal snowflake every day of the week doing something ridiculous, but there might only be like 3 of them, but you're going to see them over and over and over and over again, right? So both because of how much you see them and also, because of how vivid some of these exemplars are and the way that the availability heuristic works, we can end up with this idea that this must be what the whole other group is like. So we look at this simply by asking people for the percentage of time that they spend watching different kinds of media. These are the 2 that we've identified in particular as more conservative and more liberal, which is in line with how other people have looked at this as well. And what we find controlling for partisanship is that the more you spend time watching Fox News, the more people believe that liberals hold a lot of these extreme views, right? So they overestimate the prevalence of that for liberals. And the more time people spend watching MSNBC, the more they overestimate the prevalence of the extreme views for conservatives. We don't have causal evidence for this, but I do want to note that there is some causal evidence. So for example, Brockman and Kalla have a recent paper where they paid people who were normally Fox viewers to watch, I think it was CNN for a month or something. And it does, at least for the time period that they're watching it, change attitudes. So there does seem to be some causal evidence that these things are really as well. Social media dynamics, I want to just nod to here, although it's not something that we've looked at in this line of research. It'll come up a little bit later on. But just generally, we think that it's not just about partisan media for sure, but it's also about how people are engaging online. And so all of these same kinds of extreme exemplars are also showing up in online spaces. And we know I believe this was one of your speakers from earlier this term. We know that people tend to share really outrage-inducing, moral, emotional kinds of language to a greater degree. And so all of these kinds of dynamics, if you really boil it down, means that people are just disproportionately sharing the things that are going to make them angry and emotional and upset, that often have this kind of moralized, outrage-inducing content. We also have talked about a process, it's a little harder to get at exactly, but this process of hate sharing. So often it's not just the stuff that we share with our in-groups, so sharing extreme views that other in-group members have, but also the way that we share things that make us angry from the other side, right? So an example of this that I noted, I was trying to think, like, how could I capture this? And I haven't figured out exactly how to do it. But often you'll see these kinds of statements. So kill all men was a hashtag that showed up for a bit. And the original people who were using the hashtag were using it tongue-in-cheek. It was a bit of a joke, right? And there weren't that many people, so I wouldn't say that feminists were all like running wild saying, oh, we should kill all men. But rather, you saw it really spread and spread and spread because the people who were mad about it were, it was taking off everywhere. So a lot of the sharing was among opponents who were angry about this. And so it wasn't so much that there were very many people who were endorsing this, if anybody at all, but rather that everybody was seeing it because it was being spread by opponents. All right, the third thing that we think plays into this dynamic comes back to this idea of animosity and dislike for the out group. And so what we predicted from those original patterns that I showed you a couple of minutes ago is that it should be those extreme views, so our overestimates of those extreme views, that really predict the degree to which we dislike our outgroup or the outgroup, rather than our perception of them on the more moderate views. And so what we've done in this research, again, is correlational, but using basic mediation models, we look at the percentage of moderate views and the percentage of extreme views. These are people's estimates of those two views, and how much they predict liking of opponents. And we find consistently that moderate views predict either very little or not at all, and estimates of extreme views predict pretty strongly in each of these studies. So that predicts liking of opponents, and then liking of opponents predicts willingness to engage with opponents. And so that you can imagine turning into a bit of a feedback loop, where if you are angry at your opponents and you dislike them and then you're not even willing to talk to them, then all of these misperceptions that you have are also not going to get a chance to be corrected. Another way that we've gotten at the idea of liking is to simply ask people directly. So in one of the studies we ran, rather than just looking at what predicts liking, we asked people directly. So all of these issues that you just rated your opponents on, which ones of them cause you to like them more or less? So like what, think about how much you dislike your opponent. Which of these issues contributes to your dislike of your opponent to a larger degree? And what we find is that people indicate that it's the extreme views, so they rate the extreme views as the main basis for their dislike of opponents relative to the moderate views. And remember that the extreme views are beliefs about our opponents. We believe they hold attitudes that they actually often don't hold. So we dislike people most for attitudes that they don't actually hold. This is something that we're interested in, but we haven't gotten all that far in investigating. But we've asked in some studies about whether or not people would voice their opinion publicly about these issues, these extreme and moderate issues, after we ask them about their opponents. And what we find is that in-group members have a tendency to not want to talk about the extreme issues on their own side. So this is just looking at the degree to which they say they'd be willing to voice their own attitudes on the extreme issues of their side or the moderate issues of their side. And we find for both conservatives and liberals that they're less willing to voice their own personal opinion about those extreme issues. And although this is pretty preliminary evidence, I think that this is meaningful in large part because those extreme issues are the ones they're likely to be disagreeing with the extreme view on, right? But they're just not saying that out loud. So we see this as consistent with some work that Chris Bale has done. He talks about a number of processes that happen in social media, but one of the ones he talks about is the muting of the moderates. The fact that people who have more moderate views tend to not be heard. They're like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And they step away from the online and the sort of public discourse about these topics, leaving most of the oxygen to be taken up by the people with more extreme views, right? And I think that it can also potentially tie to this older idea of spirals of silence. So the people who are talking out loud about these things you're going to get a lot of attention. The people who are choosing to self-silence or are not talking about things, this can end up leading to a process of pluralistic ignorance where everybody believes that everyone else has a view that they don't actually have.
Yeah, just one question on that, to play with that idea. Do you think that for a moderate to be effective in that context of breaking the spiral, they'd have to talk about it in very emotional terms? So in order for the tweets to go from the red to the blue or vice versa? Because I can imagine a moderate getting in there with their moderate view, which is like less likely to have stickiness.
That's a great question. So in the last little bit of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it looks like when moderates do speak up. But I think you're pointing to something really important, which is that if you're thinking about it in terms of the ecosystem of what actually gets spread, if you're not doing it in an extreme way or a way that's going to have stickiness and actually get shared, then it might be that you're just talking to a few people at a time, right? I don't have a great answer for that, but I think it's important to think about. I've got this up here just as a note. I'm not going to talk about it in much detail, but in a couple of our studies, we also asked people just thinking about other kinds of consequences of this. And there's actually some really good work, much better developed work by Braley and colleagues recently looking at this. But in a couple of our studies, we asked people about the degree to which their party and the other party engages in ethical and unethical tactics to win elections. Both parties believe that they engage in ethical tactics and the other side engages in unethical tactics. However, simply by changing the order that we ask the question. So if we ask people, what would you support that your party does? If we ask that question right away, they say, I would support ethical tactics and I would not support unethical tactics. But if we ask them about the other party first, right, reflect on what the other party is doing, and then we ask them, what would you support your own party doing? They reduce the amount of support for ethical tactics and increase the amount of support for unethical tactics. So this is concerning to me because that can really end up triggering a cycle where, and Braley's work really gets at this, where people will engage in democratic backsliding or anti-democratic kinds of practices in the belief that they're actually doing something to save democracy. This is just another little note here. So this is switching gears a little bit, but another thing that we have in this data we've got a lot of different pieces to it. So the story is a little bit complicated to talk about. We don't talk about parts at a time. But the other thing that we can look at in here is what people believe about their opponents on these more moderate issues. So if we look just at what people believe their opponents think about moderate issues, it turns out that most people actually agree at least over the midpoint on most moderate issues. So that means that most conservatives, even though it's lower than it would be for liberals, most conservatives support LGBTQ rights. They support healthcare, they support environmental protection, so over the midpoint at least. And similarly, a lot of liberals support some degree of tax reform, support the military, and so on. So there's a fair bit of common ground in terms of at least somewhat agreeing with some of these principles. But the other side tends to underestimate the amount of common ground. So we haven't done as much with this, But we think of it as kind of a false minimization effect that's a parallel to what we're seeing in terms of false polarization. And this false minimization seems to be obscuring a lot of common ground that people have. And I think that this is also true in real world context. So this is just a poll of how many Americans support things like universal background checks, banning assault weapons, and mandatory waiting periods. And I'll say, coming from Canada, we're one of the countries with like also a lot of guns per capita, but we also have a lot of really sensible laws around who can have them and how much training you have to have, and like the safety courses and all. And we have a lot fewer shootings too, right? So it's not that the only two options are to take all the guns away or to have all the guns. These are things that most Republicans also support, right? But because of how entrenched these divides are at the political elite level, nothing gets done. As a switch to that, we also have this line of research, I just want to give you a little taste of it, where we look at these same kinds of principles, but for slightly different groups. So rather than looking here at liberals and conservatives, we're interested in the degree to which, again, people are not aware of the amount of common ground they have with people that they perceive to be opponents to them in some way. So we have a few studies where we'll look at this in terms of what people believe about feminist kinds of principles. So these are principles that we describe as moderate feminist principles, things like women and men, or in another study we have just people of all genders should have equal rights and opportunities in all aspects of life, legally and socially. Any sweeping claims about gender can be harmful and limiting to both women and men, and so on. And then we have more extreme feminism items, like men have long had more rights and power in society than women. It's time for women to gain more power and rights than men, or all men are deplorable and should be hated. And so then we ask people, do you consider yourself a feminist? Just answer yes or no. And the people who say yes agree with those moderate items and disagree for the most part with the extreme items. And the people who say no agree with the moderate items and disagree with the extreme items. So generally, we see small differences if you look at the t-tests, but generally we see a great deal of agreement between people on both sides, whether they identify as feminist or not. But where they really disagree is what the definition of feminism is. So if we ask people what defines feminism, feminists say, well, generally it's those moderate items that defines what it is to be feminist. And people who don't identify as feminists say, well, it's those extreme items that defines what it is to be feminist, and that's why I don't use that term. So I would say that this is just going to give you a sense that there are a lot of ways in which I think that our tendency to not be aware of common ground leads us to really talk past each other on a lot of these kinds of issues. And then if we actually manage to find a way to dig down to the principles that we might share, there may be more room for productive engagement. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is what might we do to mitigate this? Lots of good work being done on this topic, so we're just a small part of this. But what we started with when we wanted to ask this question was what was done in the literature so far. And so one standard approach in the literature, this is just one example, is to correct people's misconceptions, right? So we start off by figuring out what people believe, we see what the actual is, we see what the belief is, and then we let people know what the actual numbers look like, right? So in a study like what we've done, we might say, hey, you thought that it was 60% of conservatives who hold this extreme view, it's actually only 18%. And so we tried that first, and nope, didn't work. So that was a flop. We didn't get any movement at all. We tried twice and looked at a few things. One thing that we found was that people just didn't believe us. So I'm not quite sure what to do about that. I also suspect that at least part of the reason that it wasn't working is because we're really activating these extreme moralized kinds of views. So if we correct one of those views, but we've made people really angry about opponents. You know, if you tell them that opponents are really bad and terrible at this one thing, chances are they've also thought about a bunch of other ways that their opponents are also immoral. So it may be that we have not found a way to correct enough of that misconception. So I'm just telling you what's in our file drawer so far. Then we decided to switch tacks rather than continue to go down this line. So this is actually Victoria's current dissertation research I'm talking about now. And what we decided to do was a slightly different approach, and also one that maybe contributes a little bit more to the literature by trying something that hasn't been looked at quite as much so far. And this is thinking about the literature on how you can sometimes counter stereotypes by presenting like a counter stereotypic exemplar, or often rather than presenting people with, say, the statistics on something, giving people just a single vivid example can often be much more compelling to people, right? So we know this from other literatures, and we thought that this kind of approach might also work here. Now, if we think about how that plays out, say, in social media space, as Ethan mentioned before, that's not what you usually see happen, right? And so people who are engaging in maybe less extreme ways are often not the people that at least show up in front of your eyeballs so much. And we know that certain voices get amplified. So what we're imagining here is not necessarily a world that we're currently living in, but we wanted to build on this idea that maybe there are ways to unmute the moderates. And if we could demonstrate that by just like creating these scenarios for people, we wanted to see how that might affect people's estimates of what the other side was all about. So we drew to some degree on the literature on in-group dissent. And we know that there are a number of contexts where people will hesitate to dissent or disagree with their in-group, especially if they feel like their in-group is under threat. But we also know that in-group dissent can actually serve a pretty important function for a group, right? So if a group is going off course, it can be a really powerful corrective. And from the perspective of the out group, seeing that people are dissenting with one another from the in-group might also help to allow people to recognize that this out group is not actually as homogeneous as I thought it was, right? So it could help to like really show people that like just as your group has lots of variability in it, so does the out group, right? And people don't all think alike, and demonstrate that. So the way that we decided to do this was fairly low tech. So we haven't gone off and like done all of this on real Twitter, but we have created tweets for people to engage with in a number of studies. And the tweets are intended to all express relatively extreme points of view that come from one side or the other, okay? And then after people are exposed to these tweets, we assign them to one of a number of conditions where they get some kind of a response from someone else from the same in-group. So I'll first give you just kind of the numbers, what we would see with something like this. So if we show people this kind of tweet about free speech and offensive people should be banned, we find that about 39% of liberals agree with this phrasing. But we also see that about 65%, so conservatives believe that about 65% of liberals would agree with this. So this is just showing the same false polarization effect that I showed you before. But then we provide people with some kind of response to this. Okay, so now they're seeing another in-group member saying something back to this original tweet. And these are a little bit smaller, so I'm going to read a couple of examples too. So the first thing that we do is we have people self-identify. So this isn't necessarily what you would always see online, but they always start with something like liberal here, or as a liberal, I, or something like that, so that people know that this is an in-group member who is supposedly speaking in this context. And then in one condition, we have another liberal agreeing with the original tweet. And in the other condition, we have a liberal disagreeing with the tweet, okay? So in this case, liberal here, sure, some people might well use free speech to express hateful views, but it's too important a right to stop defending. Encourage respect for sure, but don't throw civil liberties out the window, okay? So it's intended as sort of an engaged, constructive disagreement from an in-group member. So what do we find across these studies? Again, so we've got 5 studies, I believe, in this package, and I'm not going to show you all of them, but I'll summarize some of what we're finding here. So we find that in general, if we have people see an agreement, it sometimes boosts their estimates a little bit, but not that much. If we have people see a disagreement, it tends to start to mitigate those estimates. So people start to go down in their estimates of how many people on the other side believe these things. We see the same thing. So this is an example for the conservatives. So I'll just read the key tweet. So, America should be for people who look like Americans. If you don't look American, you don't belong here. Immigrants go home. And a conservative says, conservative here. America is made up of all sorts of people with immigrant roots. I agree that you should accept some American values, but saying that you have to look American isn't what America's about. The Constitution says we're all created equal. Okay. So again, this is trying to mimic something that could be in-group dissent. And again, this is what conservatives, the number of conservatives who agreed with the original tweet, the number of liberals, or that liberal estimate of conservatives' agreement. And so in this study, the agreement condition didn't actually show a significant effect. The disagreement condition did. So they reduced their estimate. People agreed. So over the studies that we've done a couple of things. So first, we sometimes include that agreement condition, sometimes we don't. And then in the 3 last studies that we did, we also included a condition where people get exposed to multiple tweets, 4 or 5 of them. We call that our dogpile condition. So across all of these studies, what we generally find, we do see some bumping around. So some issues seem to work a little bit less well than others. They're all single issues in unstable political times, but in general, the patterns are very similar. We do find that dissent is consistently stronger than conformity. So one agreeing tweet doesn't do as much as one disagreeing tweet. We also find that multiple dissenters tend to have a consistently stronger effect than a single dissenter. And so this is an example of the multiple dissenters. I won't get you to read all of that. One thing I will note is that all of these are also pretty civil and constructive. So again, something that you aren't necessarily going to see on real Twitter. So multiple dissenters tend to be stronger. And we also find in studies in general that liberals tend to be a little bit more willing to change their minds about conservatives than conservatives are to change their minds about liberals. That's only a significant interaction in 2 of the studies. So for the most part, we see a bit of a glimmer in that direction, but we see the same exact pattern otherwise. In 2 of the studies, the effect for conservatives is considerably weaker. So that's something that we're still trying to get our heads around and understand a little bit better. And then similar to what we've done in the other research, we've looked at people's liking for cross partisans. And we don't find that these tweets consistently make people like their opponents better. In a couple of studies, we find a small effect. What we do find across all of the studies is the condition effect is significant, and that does predict an indirect effect through perceptions of like the percentage of opponents, leading to, or predicting, I should say, more positive feelings towards opponents and more willingness to engage. So again, correlational evidence, but something that's consistent with the model that we're suggesting. All right, I want to leave lots of time for questions, so I'll just kind of wrap up here. So what these last studies are trying to get at then is the power of dissent and imagining maybe a different sort of model of interaction in social media. I don't think anything that I've showed you here answers the question that Ethan had about, well, if you actually saw this happening in social media space, would anybody share that? Like what would actually happen? We are collecting a little bit of data on how much people like this kind of interaction. People generally like it quite a lot, right? So it's not that they don't want to see this, but it doesn't tend to be what really gets traction online. But you can also think about ways in which maybe that would change. So we've found, in a lot of our studies, pretty small effects, but pretty consistent ones. And these are all pretty low tech as well, right? So you're just getting a single exposure in a lot of these cases. And so we recognize some of the limitations there. But at the same time, we're just sort of scratching the surface of what happens in social media spaces more generally, and possibly suggesting ways that we might reimagine some of those social media spaces. So who do we reward? Who do we retweet? Right? So this is something that I've actually tried to do. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter, but when I do, I tend to actually reward and retweet the dissenters rather than the people who are just kind of going along with the crowd, because I want to see that, right? I want to actually encourage that kind of engagement. So generally right now, these kinds of constructive and moderate voices don't tend to get a lot of traction online. They're pretty muted, but that's not the only world we could imagine. I also want to end, though, by just kind of tackling this question about political polarization. So sometimes when we talk about issues like this, it can come across like, hey, why don't we just all get along and meet in the middle, right? And one thing that I'm not encouraging or trying to be a proponent of is the idea that we should all just find compromise somewhere between the left-wing side and the right-wing side, and that somewhere in the middle is the right position. I think that in many cases, a really well-functioning democracy needs very, very vigorous disagreement, right? But what I would say is we need to be disagreeing on the things that we actually believe, right? So if we're disagreeing, we're tilting at windmills and fighting imaginary monsters instead of actually tackling the true disagreements on the ground, then we could end up putting a lot of our energy into things that aren't really going to get much, are not going to have much impact in the long run. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So it makes sense that multiple social systemic factors converge to create this political polarization. But you kind of fall short of explaining why this convergence is happening in the last decade or two, right? Now, I wonder if the answer to this may have to do with the fact that US hasn't had any for a long time. I mean, viable, strong enough. I mean, Iran, Iraq, those Middle Eastern countries. Russia, well, until recently, right? But still, Russia is kind of falling apart anyways. I mean, on the surface anyway. So, so this seems like old sheriff experiment on outside group, Robert Cave, to solve your worst problem, your in-group is to create an outside enemy. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really good question. I don't have a great answer for you, except to say that certainly at times historically, when there is a clear consensus on an enemy, then you tend to get more solidarity within groups. It's not clear to me whether that would happen right now. And a couple of examples of where it might not. So there were some philosophers who wondered at the beginning of the pandemic whether the coronavirus would actually be this common enemy, right? That would bring people together. And that was one possible path that definitely was not the path that ended up happening. I also look at a little bit, I don't know enough about this to say too much, but a little bit about the discourse on the left and right around Russia and Ukraine and other things like that. So maybe that's not enough of a direct threat on America right now, but there is certainly a lot more divergence there than there is consensus across parties. So I'm not sure whether that would be the thing that would solve it, but I do think that that's probably at least one of the components of times in history where there's been more solidarity. I mean, the other thing that I guess I'd ask if I wanted to really try to investigate that is the degree to which that's also true across different countries. So we see this kind of polarization, especially stark in the West or in America, but it's happening in a lot of other countries too, some of whom probably do have these external threats and others don't. So it'd be an interesting question to ask whether or not you see less of that polarization in places where there is an external threat, but not a question I can answer. Dave, and then you.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much this is a phenomenon of typical voter, or rather a phenomenon of educated elites. If you take a look at cable news, Fox gets about 2 million people a night. MSNBC gets about 1 million people a night. I just looked, and that's not 30 million people who vote. So I'm wondering, this comes from sort of a Phil Converse point of view, that for a lot of people, life goes on. It is as it always has been. Their politics are vaporware, really. But there are things happening at an elite level that produce subclasses that are producing polarization, and where any intervention should be aimed at. So I just wanted to get your sense of, we're talking about the typical voter, are we talking about specific subclasses of voters?
I think that a lot of the dynamic that I'm talking about is probably happening more, being produced more by the educated elite. What's happening on Twitter is almost certainly the educated elite, and Twitter is a pretty small percentage of like how many people are actually engaging in Twitter space is a relatively small percentage. But at the same time, the people who are on Twitter include most journalists. So the way in which that discourse then makes its way into mainstream media it's hard to pin down exactly, but it's pretty clear that there's an effect on the more general discourse as well. Who watches things like Fox and MSNBC is a different demographic, so it's not just all the same folks that are on Twitter for sure. But again, you see these similar sorts of patterns. The effect for Fox viewers is actually largest among older people, right? So it's different demographics are getting reached in different ways. There's one, I'm forgetting the names of the authors now, I apologize, but there is one paper that tried to get at this within poli-sci and looked at how it doesn't actually matter if you're the one getting exposed to this directly, if it filters through your social contacts and connections, right? So if you've got ties to people, then that's another way that it can end up filtering in. But having said that, this is also, like, there's a lot of people in the middle who really are not particularly engaged in this. And is that what Jana spoke about when she was here?
Yeah.
But so, is it Krupnik? Is that how you say? Sorry? Okay, yes. The work that she's doing looks at how a lot of people are actually just not interested in talking about politics, and so you actually have a divide as well among people who want to really get into this stuff and people who just don't want to have any of it. And there's some other work on kind of a disengaged and exhausted middle is what I think the common, what's that thing called? More in common, yeah. They've looked at different demographics of people. So yeah, I think that this definitely doesn't include everyone. But to some extent, these dynamics may still matter for people who are less engaged by pushing them to be even less engaged and to not want to wade into it with their maybe more moderate views. Okay. Ethan?
I think you kind of addressed one of my questions, which was wanting to know more about the silent majority and whether they're being silent because of a lack of emotion around these issues or other factors like fear of getting involved. Because we know if we light people up, then they should be more motivated to get on there and do things. So I'm curious if anyone's profiled that systematically to see, are the extremists and the moderates equally engaged with these issues, or are there discrepancies at that point, which is channeling things differently? So you kind of addressed that with the different demographics, but I have a second question. But is there anything else you wanted to say on that one?
I think that the answer is probably complicated. There's some people who have just turned off of politics and don't have anything to do with it. But it does sound like there's a group of people who are still engaging, and they have the issues they care about, and they're having conversations, but behind the scenes and in small groups or with close ties. So it's not the case that the people that you don't see engaging are not engaged at all. But I don't know that we have great numbers about who those folks are. And I could imagine that might also be interesting generationally, right? So if younger people who are engaged in politics don't actually see that modeled in what they're observing when they see politics play out in public, it may be that changes generationally. Like people are either going to say, I don't want to have anything to do with this, or I guess if I do, then I have to be all in as a more extreme voice.
So second question, just your opinion, when you think about the future in this space, how optimistic or pessimistic are you? And the reason I ask is because it seems like many of the factors that are giving rise to this phenomenon are in fact driven by financials. And the financials are pushing companies in a direction that is stoking these kinds of issues, which suggests that if you leave those companies unregulated, things may not really change. I mean, if we look at social media in other contexts in terms of the implications for well-being and other things, it's only gotten worse in many ways as the algorithms have gotten more refined towards keeping people dialed in. So that's not a very, from my point of view, optimistic view of the future. So do you think about that? What's your position? Do you think we need to regulate? What should we do?
Yeah, so it's outside of my expertise what we ought to do, but my general conclusion is that if we focus, as social psychologists have often done, if we focus on like individual interventions, like, you know, getting these two people to sit down and talk, or like, you know, perceiving your opponent a little bit differently, that's almost certainly not going to be enough. So thinking about how we might actually reimagine things at a systemic level, and that probably means things like, you know, what can we, the business model for media and social media has not always been what it is now. Does that mean we go back to what it was before? Not necessarily, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be what it is now. And similarly, the way that social media plays out and the norms in social media, we know that these kinds of things are pretty entrenched once they get going, but we also know that norms can change, right? And so like what it is that we might do to see those kinds of norms actually get altered, I don't know. But that's where I would imagine change potentially happen.
Thank you. Great stuff. So I have two-part question. The first part is your description, like your explanation around this is around misperceptions about the out-group. I'm curious if you asked people's perceptions about what their in-group think. So the first part where you were showing how people are off for extreme opinions, you're asking conservative to judge liberals and vice versa. How are they in you know, estimating their own group? And the second part of my question is a little bit more philosophical. Like we ask people here, like, what do you think? You know, what percent of people, you know, believe X? And I wonder if in people's minds, it's like, we're not asking people about how much, but we're asking like whether you know, like, for modern versus extreme positions, like how important it is to them. So in people's mind, when they're saying, you know, a high percentage, like I almost feel like they're just like weighting by how much people are talking. And we do know there are like some studies that are showing the degree that people are sort of overestimating is a function of how loud people are about the particular topic. So even if, you know, there were no intermediaries that were selecting all the more extreme stuff, we ourselves perhaps are more loud to the degree that we're, and that might be corresponding to some actual, you know, value that we put on these more extreme positions. So, like, is it really? Are they really wrong? So, yeah.
That's a good, yeah. So to answer, I remember your first.
The first
part was about in-group.
Yeah.
Yeah. So straightforward answer for that: people also overestimate their in-group, not to the same degree that they overestimate their out-group, but generally they're missing the mark on their in-group as well, and thinking that there's more agreement with those extreme views, and that seems to be related to some degree to their unwillingness to voice dissenting opinions, because they think that they're more in a minority for having a dissenting opinion. The second part about, so if I'm going to try to talk about how I understood your question, at least, the people who are loudest are often like most passionate, most engaged in a topic, and they're often the ones who actually like know the most about it, right? So when I talk about extremists, I'm well aware too that like there's some overlap with like important activism in cases there, right? So, and I'm also aware that when I talk about the left and the right, there's this potential for perceiving like a false equivalence and that kind of thing, where some of these kinds of things, like I think that a lot of those extreme views are ones, well, as a progressive, I would say like I totally want to see those extreme views as part of the discourse, right? But I also want to see just back and forth between different kinds of views. So I think that's part of.
Yeah, I think it's more, I'm asking, I guess, a measurement question.
Yeah.
That is like when we're saying people are off, they're off by the question of, saying what percent of people, if we just polled people, would believe that.
Yeah.
But in their minds, they're not answering that question. They're answering
Right.
the question of like, what is, they're like, they might in some way think that actually it's not irrational.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, is it then a misperception or is it a measurement question? I guess is
Yeah. And it probably is at least partly a measurement question. So especially to another way that question is sometimes asked is that, like, look, it's that might only be 10 or 20% who hold these views, but they're the ones who are going to influence policy, or they're the ones who are going to be pushing whatever is happening in the future. And so those are the folks we should be paying attention to. And if you're thinking about like the politics that matters, it's that group that we should be overestimating to some degree, right? I think that there's a reasonable argument there. At the same time, I think that when we overestimate, because it means that we're underestimating the amount of dissenting opinion in that space, we might also kind of end up almost allowing that to take hold and to carry the day, because you're not seeing the dissenting views that might not always be that the dissenting view wins, but that like there's a moderating back and forth kind of process that we're missing when it's the extreme views that get all of the airspace, and that people see themselves as further and further apart on these kinds of issues. Sonia?
I'm going to let Gavin go ahead first.
I have another question that Ruth's favorite topic. Can you talk a little bit more about your approach to separating between the extreme and moderate position or perceptions in relation to other approaches in the space? I'm particularly curious. You showed, I think, pretty striking differences between the two. I'm curious if people who report high perceptions of polarization on the two measures are the same people, or if they're capturing different kinds of people. And I ask in part because I collected some not similar data quite recently and found like 0.2 correlations between similar measures. And I'm trying to figure out since then if I'm insane or if that's actually reality.
So the 0.2 correlation between, is it between?
But between something similar to the moderate measure and something similar to the extreme measure.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's the same people. One thing we're still trying to get our heads around is what is the best way of doing this? And one of the weaknesses of our approach is that it's been very informed by what the hot topics are, in the world at the moment. I think that there's some strengths to that relative to what's been done before, because some of the past work has gone back to the standard items, say on the ANES and that sort of thing. And some of those items actually have a bit of a feel like they're a little old, but they're not necessarily the hot topics that people are getting mad about today, right? So we are trying to capture that, but at the same time, because we're doing it in a way that's a little bit fast and loose, there's a problem with like operationalizing it and giving people the recipe for how to do this going forward, right? As far as what people are responding to on both, it's possible. I don't know for sure if this is always the case, but it's possible that one of the distinctions that we're getting at is something like a social versus an economic layer, or like other things that are often correlated but only weakly in terms of political parties. So certainly a lot of our extreme items seem to come from that like moral, emotional, social conservatism, social liberalism kind of space, and have somewhat less to do with the more economic things that some people would vote on. But I can't say for sure we wouldn't get it otherwise. Like we tried one with taxation, it seemed to still do something similar. We've measured like the kinds of evaluations people have. So people do distinguish these kinds of events or these kinds of positions on how extreme they perceive them to be, but also how like sort of morally outrageous they are, and a number of other dimensions like that. But I'm not sure that we've really gotten to the point where we know for sure exactly what the special sauce is that makes it one or the other kind of item. it's really tough to like try to capture the culture war, right? Like what is, and that seems to be actually a lot of what's happening psychologically for people, but it's not the way we often measure these things.
Well, if you find that, let me know, 'cause my committee will be a lot happier if I could just.
So thanks, Anne, for an awesome talk. So with respect to Jaren's like question earlier about measurement, it reminded me of the cultivation literature and communication, and that literature, especially early on, used prevalence estimates as one of the main dependent variables, right? And prevalence estimates of social issues are like really, really responsive to media use, right? Or at least they track really well with people's media diets. So you content analyze the stuff and you kind of see that people who watch more of that overestimate. I think the measurement question is interesting, right? Because what affective polarization ends up being, or false polarization ends up being, is kind of a perception of outgroup homogeneity, right? And so prevalence, like, yes, they're probably wrong, but they're also what people seem to be using to figure out, like, yeah, everybody's in that group is like that. So it's an interesting thorny thing to try to work through. But yeah, the cultivation literature would say that prevalence estimates are memory-based judgments. Accessibility of media figures really play into it, and that's what you get, this relationship. Now my actual question is, I noticed in your dissent posts, and I'm wondering if this was intentional, there was phrasing there that was, what did I call it? Identity congruent for the person who was making the dissent. So the liberals in defending free speech cited civil liberties, right? And the conservative in objecting to anti-immigrant racism says the Constitution, right? So they're using these like coded language that aligns. Was that intentional?
At least intuitively intentional, yes. So we were trying to find a way of phrasing it so that it would be believable, but that would also have that kind of like something that somebody could see agreement in, right? Like I can see myself in this dissent, even if it's not my position. So a little bit of influence from the literature on how you might be able to frame different kinds of issues, for example, with different moral foundations or other things like that to appeal to different people. So we didn't do it super systematically, but we were trying to get at that to some degree. We've played around with the way to do those responses. We have one study where we've tried just as a kind of like a start to see what had happened. It's a whole other can of worms, I think. But what would happen if we used uncivil dissent instead? So somebody basically saying like, go die, but from the same party, right? But there are a number of things within those tweets that we would probably need to disentangle to say exactly what the key components are. The other thing that I noted briefly is that we always have people self-identify, and we do that deliberately because if you get someone dissenting and you don't have that self-identification, people will typically assume that's someone from the other side. And even with the self-identification, in some cases, people will say, no, that's probably really a secret conservative, or that's, that's somebody from the other side.
So I was curious if you had a chance to like compare more knowledgeable individuals versus less, because I was curious if, like, based on some studies, I was curious if more knowledgeable people rather exaggerated the other side's extremism to a greater extent. And my second quick question is, like, because your stimuli seems pretty extreme, I was curious if you encountered any IRB like concerns about the language, or like whether it's like minimal risk, etc.
So the IRB question, we go through a process. These kinds of studies, we have to incorporate a few things to make sure that people are well aware of what they're going to be encountering. And there's basically like an escape hatch built in. So if people decide that they don't want to engage, they still get paid and can just leave. We haven't had any problems getting it through IRB, and we've got some other lines of research that I actually think are in some ways dicier than this, looking at cancel culture and like making really offensive statements and that sort of thing. So we try to do it as thoughtfully and sensitively as possible, but we have managed to do that okay. As far as knowledgeable, it's a good question. I don't think we've measured like political knowledge per se. We have measured political affiliation and identity, and people who have stronger identities tend to show these effects more strongly. And I guess that that's probably associated with political knowledge, but they're probably not exactly the same thing.
I couldn't help throughout the course, excuse me, the talk, start thinking about old 1970s, 1980s psychology. In particular, the representation of concepts and the old prototype versus exemplar distinction. And in essence, your questions are asking about prototypes, asking about social tendencies. And I'm intrigued by the idea that in some sense that's hard for people because they're thinking in terms of exemplars, certain characters. And because liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans are transitive, they might be thinking in terms of ideals, or that's what's available to them as opposed to the central tendency. So I was wondering to what extent people might be in a hard way, in the sense that they can't really think of the typical person they may meet from a political group because the cognitive material they have in their head is something different.
We went through the literature on prototypes and exemplars and all that. We thought, like, how much should we dig into this and like map it onto these ideas specifically? And we've only very loosely considered those things. But I think that you're definitely onto something. One of the things that I think has been at least a partial response from my PhD student who's chosen to do some of the methods were methods that she's opted for and has defended at various points. And one of the things that we thought might help with, like, are people just have a particular prototype in mind, is prevalence estimates. So you might have, if you were just asking people, like, what does the typical Republican think on a scale from 1 to 10? Then it's going to be the prototype you have in mind, and you're going to say what that prototypical Republican thinks, and that's often going to be more extreme. We thought that the prevalence estimates might get around that to some extent. And we've tried in a couple of studies to disentangle that a little bit more just in the wording that we give. So for example, in a couple of studies, we ask people to rate elites first, and then we say, now we want you to think about the average voter. Right, so ways to try to disentangle from what you might be imagining as like the typical person. We get the same patterns regardless, but I don't think we've got a full answer to that, but those are a couple of things we've tried.
Can I ask still? Yeah, I found this anger. Well, you mentioned anger somewhere. Anger. Angry emotion.
Yeah.
Right. I forgot the finding, but I found it extremely interesting. That seems like use of anger to create a tribal unity. Basically something awful happened to you. Again, this gets back to my enemy theme. Something awful happened to you, say, for example, losing a job or getting some horrible thing for some other reason. Your friends or your tribal members would be upset and become very mad at somebody who may be causing this. And so in the current climate, when something happened to you here, most obvious enemy is the Republicans, right? And vice versa outside of Ann Arbor. So I'm just curious if there might be any systematic research on the theme, that is functional role of anger in political polarization.
So anger and outrage as two fairly related kinds of emotions have certainly been looked at. It's only something we've touched on in our work empirically, but in general, there's a bit of a debate to begin with. So Billy Brady, who was here earlier this term, has been part of that debate. And he's argued that some of the ways that we express anger and outrage may actually not be all that adaptive because of the affordances of these social media spaces and that sort of thing, pulling for anger and outrage in ways that might not really be productive. But at the same time, we know that like anger that's a very like action-oriented kind of emotion. So people do things when they're angry. And so it's something that activists use, right? So you need to get people angry and outraged if you want to really fire a movement. Politicians know that anger is one of the better drivers of political engagement. So if you get people angry, they're more likely to come out to vote, they're more likely to donate and to engage in activism for your campaign, right? So there's a lot of reasons why there's going to be incentives to increase anger in those ways. And so that's what I know about it. I don't know if that answered your specific question, but was there another piece to it that?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say that this is a very interesting point.
Yeah.
And more broadly, that might, well, this and some other similar processes may explain how, psychology can influence social systems so easily. So I don't know how seriously you insert ideology between psychology and social system, that arrow directing from psychology to social system, you may not necessarily need it, right? Need ideology. Basically, social system adjusts so well, especially on this topic. Basically CNN says whatever it says because it knows that some people would be very happy to hear whatever they say, and Fox News vice versa. So in this case, really psychology is shaping up social system almost immediately. It seems like feedback loop is so short, so quick.
And it's something that the media industries often have almost in real time. They know what people are experiencing, right? So they can adjust things in ways that will respond to really intensify those kinds of emotions.
On that note, it's 5 o'clock or just after. I realized the clocks are about wrong. It's a little slow. So, but thank you so much for coming out on this great talk. Yeah. Thank you all for coming out to this note today.